It's a pleasure this afternoon to welcome Dr Shaun Henson to come and give this afternoon's seminar. Dr Henson researches and teaches in Oxford in the Faculty of Theology and Religion, and he's also chaplain at St Hugh's College. He gained his undergraduate and postgraduate degrees at Boston and at Duke universities in the US, and then did his PhD in Oxford, jointly with John Hedley Brooke and Keith Ward, two names who are both very well known in Faraday. His PhD doctoral research examined the debate between physics and philosophy and the unification of nature's laws. He has academic interests in the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion, and teaches in areas like science and religion and Christian doctrine. He's also a priest in the Church of England, being ordained towards the end of his time doing his doctorate, and he's worked in parishes around Oxford and Blenheim Palace. He's also got social concerns that are reflected in his life as a member of the Third Order of the Society of St Francis. So it's a pleasure to welcome Dr Shaun Henson to come and talk to us this afternoon. The title of his talk is God and the Order of Nature, Unity and Plurality. Will you join me in welcoming Shaun?
Thank you very much indeed. What has God to do with natural order? That's a question I want to entertain today with respect to an actual dialogue between ideas of unity in physics and more widely elsewhere, and plurality in philosophy and also more widely elsewhere. And this comes from one of my recent books, What Has God to Do with Natural Order? And that's the book, God and Natural Order. Presented here, of course, in a necessarily summarized form. And I fear I'm doing violence to my own work, hopefully not to my ability to explain it to you in 45 minutes or so. So what has God to do with natural order might be met by further questions, and fair enough. Which God and what order, for instance? The true answer to what has God to do with natural order is plenty in the history and philosophy of science, of course. This is perhaps a familiar image to some of you. Some call it God the Geometer. I don't know if it has a particular name, in fact. Depicting God as a kind of architect or builder or geometer or craftsman. I've seen it on the cover of a book, which might even be out there on the table recently. Now, the true answer to what has God to do with natural order is, as I say, plenty in the history and philosophy of science. And in a way, this is despite what we may or may not believe about God. The idea of a single omnipotent creator has often functioned in the history of science to ratify the notion of a unified nature, and vice versa. Concepts of God, usually Christian, have for centuries found alliance, we might say, with scientific evidences for a natural order, tidied, if you will, by an apparent unity of physical laws. At times, theological views seem to have driven unifying scientific projects. Some recent philosophers of science have challenged the belief that nature can be reduced clearly to anything like a theory of everything, in physics, for example. An interesting problem for Christian thought is that some philosophers we might call metaphysical pluralists consider the same God not a unifier at all, but a guarantor of the diversity they proclaim. God, by their reckoning, is best considered a lover of plurality, a kind of divine metaphysical pluralist. We might ask then, which is the Christian God, unifier or pluralist, insofar as one might take the question seriously at all, and if one has to choose. And if we're going to talk about the Christian God, an interesting further question is how a Trinitarian theology, for example, that makes explicit some of the concepts implicit in this particular debate I'm going to talk about today, might hypothetically alter the discussion. Must God be vague in this discussion, and perhaps others like it, or might we at least see, hypothetically, whether a Trinity does any real work for us or it simply obfuscates matters, as some would suppose. Thinkers like Sir John Polkinghorne, of course, of Cambridge, or Keith Ward, quite recently, have considered the Trinity in a scientific context. The theologian and philosopher Wolfhart Pannenberg, I'm going to look at in detail today, has presented an intriguing Trinitarian creation theology that can be shown to fit this particular unity and plurality discussion unusually well. His offering, informed by the sciences and philosophy, contains unique factors that would even seem to suggest a limited kind of synthesis, at least for theological and metaphysical features of the dialogue between physics and philosophers on unity and plurality. Following Pannenberg's own Hegelian manner of thinking, and he rather likes Hegel, as far as I can see, a dialectic between unifying physics and diversifying philosophy of science can be demonstrated as a kind of thesis and antithesis. We might even understand this to be a kind of updated scientific version of pre-Socratic arguments between Parmenides and Heraclitus, arguing for one or many respectively. Acknowledging human theory choice, I think, too, after all, might help to explain the millennial-long character of such arguments, including this recent scientific guide. And I tend to see the dialectic in this way. Some themes and ideas serving as a collective backdrop for what I want to cover in our time together are, as I just mentioned, the great pre-Socratic debates over the one or the many, some thoughts about scientific method, questions concerning whether or not theology can or should be considered as hypothetical information, like a science, the efficacy of scientifically informed theological ideas, and science and religion as a field of investigation. Humorously, you might even think of this dialogue as a convivial conversation down the pub. In walks a physicist, followed by a philosopher, and they begin to talk about these ideas, and later in walks a theologian who overhears them and thinks, they've just said the word God, and some other concepts that I use in my work, and then ensues a conversation. So it's a bit like this kind of thing that I envision. This is what we'll cover. The introduction and background I've just given you. God is unifier is the first part of the dialectic, scientific unification and its theological alliances. God is pluralist, philosophical challenges to scientific unification. We're going to talk about a Trinitarian creation, which comes from Wolfhart Pannenberg, and try to test that in a certain kind of way. And then we'll talk about the material and methodological limits that seem quite obvious to me in this kind of conversation or dialogue. So first, in the dialectic of God is unifier or pluralist, God is unifier, the thesis, scientific unification and its theological alliances. It's not difficult to establish from religious or scientific vantage points that human beings have an endemic need for the intelligibility of our own lives and the world around us. This intelligibility, when found, tends to show inextricable connections with various concepts of unity. The impulse to unify is a means to achieving this intelligibility and finds easy ground in drives to reduce and comprehend everything. One could go further, declaring that all theologies and sciences work in the human mind to unify and make intelligible our existence. What some philosophers see as a reductionist attitude in physics comes from an evidenced conviction, and very evidenced, that all of nature's principles or laws are as they are because of deeper underlying principles or laws. As these continue to be uncovered, they merge in a sense, uniformly pointing toward yet deeper shared aspects of forces and structures in nature. I was thinking even this morning of Michael Faraday, for whom this center, I presume, is named, and electromagnetism, just for a quick and easy example. The trend continues until quantum mechanics, special relativity, and Newtonian mechanics merge to form two pillars of modern physics, quantum field theory and general relativity. Locating the guiding principle combining these final two would be a step toward a quantum theory of gravitational interactions, yet to be definitively uncovered, like string theory or other candidates. We might say that the God of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, for example, is metaphorically like the very deepest of these explanatory principles or laws, being an explanation of everything. Monotheistic theology has for several centuries found alliance or formed alliances with scientific evidences for ordering nature by a unity of physical laws. Scientific projects seeking support for concepts of nomological, that is, of course, law-based unification, have often looked to monotheistic concepts of God. The very idea of a law of nature has a strong basis in Christian monotheism, even if, yes, of course, alongside other factors. We find such examples in the developing sciences when we look to a surprising degree. And I remember when researching for this, asking John Hedley Brooke, who you just mentioned, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? And he said, yes, that's what you're seeing. It really is there. And so I'll offer now just several covered in much greater detail in the book examples. Johannes Kepler, for example, with him we have what I call an harmonious world as evidence of God's Trinitarian perfection. He was specifically Trinitarian in his thinking. Kepler presented his work as a search for order and unity in a world designed and governed by God. In his understanding, God had equipped us with mathematical capabilities for uncovering otherwise hidden natural patterns. And when asked, what do you judge to be the layout of the principal parts of the world, Kepler wrote of the sphere as having a Trinitarian nature. He said this, and I'm quoting, of course translated, for in this sphere, which is the image of God the Creator and the archetype of the world, there are three regions, symbols of the three persons of the Holy Trinity. The center, a symbol of the Father, the surface of the Son, and the intermediate space of the Holy Ghost. At times, connections between God and unity have even preceded evidences for unity, which is very interesting indeed, even if by hap or coincidence. René Descartes, with Descartes we have God's mathematics as the unifying language of creation. Descartes articulated the need for a unified physics, building on the work of Galileo, emphasizing mathematics. Descartes believed that he was, quote, discovering the laws that God has put into nature. Zipping ahead rather speedily, and I do cover more thinkers and in more detail in the book, Isaac Newton. With Newton we have a concept of God as guarantor of nature's unifying laws. For Newton, God was not just the guarantor of the rationality and intelligibility of nature and its universal laws, but God and a unified nature were, in fact, inseparable. For at least the late 1660s, among his chief goals was to demonstrate matter as being directly dependent on God. Gravitation was not inherent in matter, Newton reasoned, but operated because an agent, the creator, acted constantly according to certain laws. Newton's view of a unified creation through God was so great, he devoted considerable time to the study of theology and alchemy, as no doubt some of you will know well, often at the exclusion of his beloved mechanics. Zipping ahead yet again, we have Albert Einstein, a final example, who spoke of a rapturous amazement at the harmony of natural law, and of course, quite famously, also of a God who does not play at dice with the universe or with the laws of nature. This is the look you might get if you were named Niels Bohr or someone similar and you thought God does play dice. That's just a bit of humor. Although that is really him, I must say. Quite recent scholarship by those who knew Einstein personally, like Max Jammer, who wrote Einstein and Religion, and Abraham Pace, who wrote Subtle is the Lord and Einstein Lived Here, concludes that Einstein intended to say that a necessary interdependent relationship exists between science and religion. And further, that in Einstein's mind, this relationship extended to relations between a form of God and a deterministic, harmonic, and unified nature. Einstein, who is still today an inspiration for unifying physics, often referred to God, observed that a drive for intelligibility, akin to the quests of religious seekers as he saw it, was the reason behind all scientific investigations. While ideas of God have continued gradually since the Enlightenment to vanish from acceptable scientific discourse, figures like Einstein still drew quite strong connections, even in public statements. And it's much debated, despite the likes of Max Schemer and Abraham Pay's, exactly how we are to locate these concepts. He did deny that he was an atheist, and he got angry when even called an agnostic. We know that much. But still, his concept of God was not traditional or like some of us might have. A turning point affecting Einstein's kind of science and religion musings came around mid-century, coincidentally, approximately following his death. Those continuing to work toward unity in the form of a quantum theory of gravitational interactions, whether through a conventional particle physics or more esoteric notions, do not consider God officially, of course. God still makes the occasional appearance, however, even if as the uninvited guest, from whose philosophical implications, unifying physics and broader cosmological considerations cannot seem to escape, try though we do. Even where no ideas like cosmological fine-tuning, for example, or any other potentially theological notions are debated or assumed, God often remains as a concept directly negated, as if to say, and by the way, this has nothing to do with God. Whatever we make of the theological roots and their potential connections for today's purely scientific concepts, traditional monotheism did so influence early unifying physics. Perhaps no surprise there, that it seems difficult to escape even now entirely from them, even if in the negative, when engaging with wider culture. And whatever connections between scientific unity and theology have existed to this day, the concept is one of a God who unifies the order of nature. Now that roughly, and in not as much detail as I would like to be able to give you, it's simply impossible, is the thesis, God as unifier. And so what we might call the antithesis in this dialectic, God as pluralist, philosophical challenges to all that I've just given you, to scientific unification. An antithesis to all that I've just said can be found in a recent school of philosophers of science, most notably Nancy Cartwright. She challenges any notion that nature is reducible to a unity, as with a singular mathematical theory of everything, for example. She also works in economics to the same ends. Cartwright posits an alternative grand metaphysics, as I see it. I've never heard her say that. And with its own theological implication, which is clear even in her books and writings. She questions the philosophical and scientific assumptions and methods leading to conclusions that our world, by virtue of physical laws, is somehow metaphysically one or unified, or at least theoretically unifiable. She argues against what she sees as expensive, imperialistic unifying projects in physics, proceeding, in her view, from a faulty metaphysics of unity, for which there, in her view again, is little real evidence and too few verifiable success stories, as she tells this story. Cartwright names this intrepid advance, disregarding, in her view, its own paucity of evidences, a scientific fundamentalism. In essays and books, and this is Nancy Cartwright, as she more or less appears today. In essays and books like How the Laws of Physics Lie, Nature's Capacities and Their Measurement, and The Dappled World, Cartwright argues repeatedly three recurring theses, and I'll give them to you in brief. The first is that the impressive empirical successes of our best physics theories may argue for the truth of these theories, but not, she says, for their universality. The laws of physics, she says, apply only where its models fit, and that apparently includes only a very limited range of circumstances. Secondly, she argues that the laws of nature, where they do obtain, hold only ceteris paribus, not simpliciter. The laws hold only, quote, in circumscribed conditions, or so long as no factors relevant to the effect besides those specified occur, end quote. Her idea is one of metaphysical nomological pluralism, a doctrine in which nature is, quote, governed in different domains by different systems of laws, not necessarily related to each other in any uniform way, a patchwork of laws. Thirdly, she argues that our most wide-ranging scientific knowledge is not of laws, but of the natures of things. This is an updated, and I must say, in some sense, rather opaque form of Aristotelian natures that she wants to see happen, allowing us, she says, to build new nomological machines. I think she invented that term. Correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps later. New nomological machines never before seen, giving rise to new laws never before dreamt of. And a nomological machine for Cartwright can be the alignment of planets. It can be something done in a laboratory by human beings. It can be something as simple as the building of a battery with plastic and metal and the right chemical compounds. It's that what we tend to see as laws happens locally. This is her point. And she relates this to Aristotle's idea of nature's residence in things. Borrowing from the Catholic poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, she presumes that, as appearances suggest, we live in a dappled world, a world rich in different things, with different natures, behaving in different ways. Following Hopkins and others, Cartwright prefers a God, and she does mention God here and there in her works. She prefers a God who has created nature in great plurality, and is a lover of such. She is in effect, as I see it, recovering a less well-tread, but no less Christian concept, highlighting the particular above the general, written of especially by medieval thinkers like John Duns Scotus, here and there, also in Thomas Aquinas. Hopkins' poem, Pied Beauty, which is just there, makes the patchwork world evidence of God's design, and in fact a cause for worship. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brindled cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-cold chestnut falls finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plough, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. She has that entire poem as an example of what she's after, if after anything theological. She isn't particularly theological, I must add, but that's her image of any God that might exist. And so the main theological point to be taken from Cartwright is that the same Christian God, from which, of course, also this tradition comes, should this God exist, might not be a unifier, but a guarantor of the diversity that she and others proclaim. We have then a thesis of unity and an antithesis of plurality, both drawing ultimately from Christian ideas of God, but diverging in their conclusions. And so what are we to do? Enter Wolfhart Pannenberg, who in the second of his 3-volume Systematic Theology and elsewhere in other works, presents a scientifically informed, deeply detailed Trinitarian vision of creation, with material and methodological characteristics that offer what can seem, even at first glance, plausible resolutions for at least some of the philosophical and theological aspects of the God as unifier or pluralist debate. Of course, Pannenberg isn't going to solve this problem in physics, or even the debate between Cartwright and those she argues in dialogue against, we might say, unifying everything. But he would like to think that he could, I think, and I did in fact get a chance to talk to Pannenberg about this, and I'll say more about that in a few moments. This is Wolfhart Pannenberg in younger days, and sadly he died in 2014. Now, this promise of some kind of limited, and of course limited, synthesis is suggested by virtue of several key ideas. Pannenberg bases his entire offering on a divine Trinitarian inner life of relations between the persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Undergirding the scheme is Pannenberg's idea that God is the alles bestimmende Wirklichkeit, the all-determining reality, such that gaps will appear, he says, in any discipline, scientific or otherwise, when God is not sufficiently considered. Pannenberg commentator Ted Peters has called this Pannenbergian idea theology as a field-encompassing field of research, capable of encompassing, just as it sounds, other fields of research. God, according to Pannenberg, has birthed a creation marked by unities and pluralities, centering on laws of nature, reminiscent of God's own Trinitarian character and activities. Pannenberg's methodology includes a high regard for bottom-up, from below approach to doing theology like a science. And this means that one often begins with public knowledge, as experienced in the world by everyone, whether they believe in a God or not. And for example, with this unity-plurality debate, rather than beginning with a theological doctrine or problem, which we might call an approach from above, one then takes the issue or problem seeking to show the degree to which Christian theology might, in his view, hypothetically, it's a very important word for Pannenberg, make sense of or resolve it, in effect combining the approaches. Closely related is Pannenberg's regard for a dialectical approach generally to any problem, which is exactly as I have constructed this presentation. Thesis, antithesis, and a kind of synthesis, often associated with the philosopher Hegel. Giving force to each of these concepts is Pannenberg's further daring notion of treating all theological propositions as hypotheses. And that idea, which can seem terribly unorthodox to someone who is a theologian or believes, allows Pannenberg great creative freedom for attempting to demonstrate traditional theology to cohere with scientific thought. I'm sure I won't need to tell you about the scientific method when I'm teaching undergraduates. I talk about Francesco Redi from Florence, the medical doctor who came upon this problem of abiogenesis, where people would, before refrigeration, leave meat out on the kitchen table, for example. And we know what happens if it's left there long enough. We get musca domestica, the common housefly, and people thought these houseflies were just appearing, life out of nothing, abiogenesis. And he thought that must not be true, and so he set about a series of experiments attempting to prove, and indeed, by the end, no flies, no maggots. Pannenberg saw his theology, and his work today evidences it, as a kind of gradual refinement toward the truth. He believes in revelation. He believed in things like the resurrection, even of Jesus Christ, this sort of very traditional doctrinal view. But he was open to seeing theology hypothetically again, and to even changing his views if he was shown to be wrong. He argues in his work for, I'll skip over the scientific method. He argues in his works for the action of the one God in relation to the world, and he says things like this: the action of the one God in relation to the world is not wholly different from the creation, from the action in his Trinitarian life. In his action in relation to the world, the Trinitarian life turns outward, moves out of itself, and becomes the determinative basis of relations between the Creator and the creatures. And that's an end of quote. This outward turning shows creation itself to have been a Trinitarian act, Pannenberg says, with the several persons having a unity of creative purpose and a diversity of divine actions, and with various evidences of a Trinitarian creator evidence in the created reality, sort of vestiges of the Trinity is a term we might use. Pannenberg mediates between what we can see as positions of scientific fundamentalism on one hand, and a notion of metaphysical nomological pluralism on the other. a unity by natural laws and the creative outworking of a plurality of forms of creatures. Pannenberg credits, for example, in the detail I mentioned, to the cooperation of the Son of God and the Spirit of God. Jesus as Logos for Pannenberg becomes the quintessence of the world's order and unity by a system of laws. The Spirit of God provides the dynamic character and functioning of the natural world in its orderliness and differentiations, including the evolution and fulfillment of the multitude of all creaturely forms. This gives you a flavor of the kind of work that he's written on creation, on this very Trinitarian creation. Pannenberg's work at every turn, however archaic these ideas could seem to some, and no doubt to some of us here, maybe even to some theologians who might be here, is to relate them always to our current scientific understandings. Yet, tremendous material limits and methodological limits appear when these three accounts are compared more closely. In the face of what anyone placing value in these theological and philosophical ideas might see as victorious, lies also great weakness. Why, for instance, must God be Trinitarian in order to accomplish creation marked by unities and pluralities? That potential weakness is compounded by the extreme detail with which Pannenberg makes connections between a Trinitarian God and the unified and plural order of nature. Pannenberg's highly detailed connections, enacted to show theological coherence with the sciences, can, it seems to me, actually derail plausibility. In effect, a reaction opposite that intended occurs. It may seem at first glance a positive thing to show the most intricate connections imaginable between a concept of God and a scientific understanding of reality. But such an approach also opens negative possibilities, and not just simply that scientific understandings may, and of course we know they usually do, change over time, requiring any correlate theological claims made in relation to be altered. It's the problem of the God of the gaps, isn't it? He's not quite doing a God of the gaps, but it's something akin to that, roughly. A theologian can make intricate claims for which there is no evidence, like for a divine inner Trinitarian life of God, and then relate that to a created order marked by vaguely similar unities and pluralities. But even other theologians can find that unpalatable, while not denying the great merits of Pannenberg's systematic work. One, we might say, Pannenberg enthusiast, the theologian Philip Hefner, has admitted, quote, "One reason Pannenberg's effort is so audacious and so difficult, and for some readers problematic, is that he insists that the creation must be related to the interior life of God." If a fellow Trinitarian theologian admits that, what might one expect a physicist or a philosopher of science to whom one is appealing to think, who might be, for example, more agnostic or perhaps an atheist? As far as this criticism may be appropriate, alternatives in the form of broadly theistic arguments in the light of the natural sciences could be more palatable. Continuing a Pannenbergian route of testing his own ideas, however, and this is his idea, set forth theological hypotheses and test them, a close re-examination of the explanatory systems of the unifying physicists, Cartwright and Pannenberg, reveals deep differences, even in defining the very terms under investigation. Each party repeats words like truth, reality, explanation, and understanding in their respective schemes and materials. Yet all mean, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, quite different things by these terms. And this is so even upon seeing that all three sets are realists of different varieties, each claiming truth is something to be had about the real world. Regarding what is true and real, deep dissimilarities appear likewise when comparing the crucial ideas, in this case, of laws of nature and associated concepts of God. Each party discusses laws of God, discusses laws and God. The ideas, however, are not quite the same things when the three accounts are more closely compared. The views expressed by each party approximate to, in fact, three principal and generally contradictory perspectives found in the history of science: necessitarian, regularist, and prescriptivist accounts of laws. The prescriptivist theory is chronologically first, dating to the time when natural philosophers came to the idea of laws of nature. Necessitarian theory, philosopher Norman Swartz criticizes as a latter-day successor to prescriptivist theory, that is nothing but prescriptivism, but without a prescriber, without a God. It's laws without a God. And there is a, following from that, residual necessity as a leftover ingredient from an earlier theologically rich view of laws, no longer now vital. Thirdly, a regularist account, as Swartz explains it, being in direct odds with necessitarianism, can be seen as a negative theory. It says there is no natural necessity, either in with regard to, or in physical laws. Necessitarianism and regularism both see laws as descriptions, but there the similarity ends. Unifying physicists could be seen as broadly necessitarian, even as Cartwright is more like a regularist. Pannenberg reinvigorates prescriptivism, but with a distinctly Trinitarian prescriber, updated for today. Hope yet remains, surprisingly, for connecting God with laws in the form of a proposal by Nancy Cartwright. She has argued, noting the strong historical and epistemological connections between the ideas of God and laws of nature, that epistemologically speaking, laws cannot be said to exist without God, in her view, by her argument. Her paper called No God, No Laws, I heard her give several years ago, intending to remind us that the concept of laws was built, at first at least, on this idea of a divine lawgiver. Nevertheless, her alternative concept of a reinvigorated Aristotelian natures resident in things provides a complete substitute, in her mind, for the idea of natural laws. She prefers the concept of Aristotelian natures as having greater explanatory power than laws. Pannenberg's claims fared much better when ideas going back to truth, reality, explanation, and understanding, when explanation and understanding were compared between the three sets of thinkers. He ties categories of explanation and understanding to philosophical concepts of part and whole, all toward a further concept of meaning. He argues that all parts and wholes in existence have their ultimate meaning in the definitive possible whole beyond all wholes, which for him is God. All of reality has this, he calls, semantic structure, according to Wilhelm Dilthey and others that he has looked at in the history of philosophy. A semantic horizon represents all that can be understood, interpreted, and discussed about a thing, or a set of things using knowledge in an investigative field at a given time in history. Reality is, in this idea, like a text, featuring wholes and parts illuminating each other toward a meaning. In each regard, reality as a whole may be interpreted via this hermeneutical method in a manner that a text can be approached. All scientific approaches to reality, whether in natural science like physics, a human art or science like philosophy, or even theology, which Pannenberg argues to have equal footing with other scientific approaches to reality, can appropriate this concept, Pannenberg believed. Now, dialectics, like that between the physicists and Cartwright, if stalemated, as a thesis and antithesis, could, in theory, be moved toward a synthesis using this proposed method. Realistically, the required hurdle is vast, however, from reintroducing pre-modern metaphysical reflections from the likes of Aristotle, connecting these to 19th century theories on hermeneutics, all towards successful theological apologetics. God, it seems by now in history, from the age of natural theology through the recent surge in science and religion studies, cannot be proven in any such way. That's no surprise, I'm sure. Even so, theology is only likely to escape a ghettoized existence, if not some future relegation to a dark age, not by avoiding metaphysics, as has been the fashion of some, but by seeking at least to address the metaphysics that 21st century physics and philosophy of science dares to suggest. This must especially be true when these disciplines first mention God, even if in varying degrees of seriousness, as I've shown today. while arguing for metaphysical schemes of unity or plurality. Pannenberg's expansive theories on explanation and understanding toward a grand metaphysic of meaning in God may be at least a good starting place, however limited these apparent relations may eventually prove to be. What of evaluating the ability of a scheme like Pannenberg's to relate constructively to secular scientific and philosophical concepts or debates? It seems that an ironic problem exists in which one can demonstrate what I call trade-offs in theologies like Pannenberg's, seeking such close relations and relevance to scientific knowledge. Perhaps subtle differences should be understood to exist between the three distinct categories of coherence, plausibility, and acceptability, and what may be achieved by pursuing them. Pannenberg's work seeks coherence with scientific knowledge, and would be plausible to some in scientific and theological communities, but indicates acceptability problems for secular and even theological audiences by virtue of this insistence on altering and using detailed theological traditions like logos, and especially hidden intertrinitarian relations as constructive factors. Pannenberg has negotiated these problems by showing a willingness to alter or even to abandon his own theological positions if new evidences point to their demise. This is precisely what he has meant by couching theology in terms of the hypothetical. Pannenberg's theology is to be viewed in terms something like ceteris paribus, as hypothetically acceptable only as long as new information does not dislocate it from its position. But in the reality of interdisciplinary discussions between theology and the sciences, can we consider theology in ceteris paribus terms, even much less simpliciter ones? Physical theories of nature's laws are accepted universally, although not that they aren't argued about, but you know what I mean. Allowing Cartwright to make an argument decreasing their vitality from simpliciter to at least ceteris paribus terms. Theological theories do not seem to have the same universal currency, do they? Couching them as hypotheses does help. On meeting Wolfhart Pannenberg to discuss my book project with him, he noted a change occurring in his thinking over the years, in which he had gradually admitted that the currency of theology in wider culture was not as he had imagined when he was a younger man, writing his earlier books. He had supposed way back then that one could prove, to use his term when speaking with him, certain things theologically. But over time, he has conceded this to be impossible. That is far from saying that what Christians or others believe about God is untrue. That's not what I'm saying. Or that we should not continue working vigorously to relate the sciences, philosophy, and theology. Far from it. We live in a world in which God is no longer a necessary hypothesis in the world's estimation. If God ever truly was, as Paul Fiddes explains in The Creative Suffering of God, his book, when recalling the God is Dead movement of the 1960s. There will always be alternative explanations and understandings for what is found in the world than God. Any study relating the sciences to religion must realize this. This does not mean that God is actually dead in human discourse or in reality, any more than Jesus Christ was finally dead in the story of his life, death, and resurrection, whether we interpret that story literally or not. One way to view, and I'm coming to an end, one way to view the conclusions from this study is to consider that the idea of divine resurrection, which along with the concept of revelation has always been very important in Pannenberg's work, seems to have a metaphorical vitality in relations between theology and the sciences. We never seem to have been able entirely to escape the notion of God. Again, even if talking about God negatively, even while attempting to kill the concept in relation to our scientific theories. Even Cartwright, an enemy of unifying physics in its present guise, argues such a disassociation to be impossible in her no God, no laws position. Last bits, the fact of the existence of the field of science and religion, which is vital enough that you have here the Faraday Institute and a Starbridge lecturer in theology and natural science, and the University of Oxford and other places have similar facilities and positions, is proof enough that scientific and religious interactions have never been decided finally one way or the other. The conversations are ongoing, they have life. And so far in history, whenever it has been assumed that they might no longer have it, we have seen these assumptions proven to be false. Connections continue to be seen, however strong or hypothetical and tenuous they may be. There is more that one could add regarding the seeming fit of Pannenberg's Trinitarian system with the problem of the one and the many, and God as unifier or pluralist, toward further research projects. A plethora of purely scientific research projects, having in most cases nothing to do with ideas of God or science or religion, could be seen to connote a reality made up, for example, of sets of unities and pluralities, not just either one or many things. The mathematician Margaret Morrison argues neither for a metaphysics of unity or of disunity, but for something in between, that is, for her closer to the actual available evidences. We have others like Murray Gell-Mann exploring in his book The Quark and the Jaguar, popular book, worth reading, celebrating a world featuring intricate connections between the unified laws of nature and the complexity and diversity of the natural world. And of course, especially of late, multiverse theories hypothesize a potentially infinite number of universes, including ours, with researchers dedicating much energy to that work. Andre Linde, and I really am now near the end, another physicist, is said to have been unconvinced, at least by earlier Hawking-Hertog notions of multiverse. All the while, Linde, who is an author of inflationary cosmology, is known for a similarly based multiverse idea of one cosmos with many universes. Linde has explained his theories in books like Inflation and Quantum Cosmology, and his theory is of a self-reproducing inflationary universe, describing our universe as a single self-generating fractal that sprouts other universes. Linde has even considered the possible religious implications of his views, assuming his theories to be, quote, much closer to polytheism or to atheism than to the picture of a uniform universe created at a single moment and governed by a single law in all of its parts, which had much more in common with monotheism, end quote. Yet, a theologian like Pannenberg, given his views on a Trinitarian reality of wholes and parts, would conclude no such atheistic viewpoint. Linde would only be making a potentially damning theological observation for Pannenberg if Christian monotheism were not Trinitarian. But as the Christian conception stands, a universe in any guise, imagined of one or many, might serve as evidence, not refutation of God. Pannenberg was careful to acknowledge that if the world is ever to understand the divine origins of its existence from the triune God, this would surely come, quote, only in light at the end of history, an eschaton. Pannenberg, of course, may be proven entirely wrong in all that he proposed, if this eschaton for which his hypotheses await ever comes. And yet, his views on a Trinitarian reality are hardly stranger than some of the scientific theories I've just mentioned, at least to the minds of some, and that we believe, at least many do believe to be true. As long as scientific theories like Hawking's or Linde's about a multiverse abound, or problems like this dialectic between unifying physics and people like Cartwright's philosophy exist, Pannenberg's thought and science and religion projects similarly themed will have life, however hypothetical that life may be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've stretched our minds, and I can see a question already there at the back. So, Cars with the microphone.
So it would help me to appreciate this dialectic you've set up a little bit better if I could see how it would operate in practice and maybe some examples in science. So I'd like to offer sort of a historical one and some current ones for your consideration and your response. So just historically, I'm wondering, there's all these kinds of examples of pluralities, of material, of species, of fundamental particles, which science would claim to have a unifying explanation. I'm wondering whether these philosophies somehow would countermand what is the traditional scientific view of unity on those questions. For the modern sort of issues, I think of, as you were alluding to it toward the end, some of these cosmological boundaries of physical understanding, or, perhaps more interestingly, we try to look at the juncture between neuroscience and physics, chemistry, where, you know, the scientific fundamentalist point of view might be, you know, consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of some, you know, biochemical reactions and so forth. And is that a place maybe where these philosophies would give different perspectives?
Yes. Nancy Cartwright does talk in, for example, her book, The Dappled World, about medical ideas, and she talks about cures for cancer, and essentially, and I know Nancy a bit, my sense of her arguments is that, and she might not like me saying this, but in a way, even she doesn't believe that mathematically we can't show unity, for example, with the laws of nature. I mean, clearly, there's been an advance again with even going back to Michael Faraday and so forth and so forth and so on. She's arguing for a paucity of evidences such that we might overlook the richness of plurality. And in her case, she's a very practical thinker. And when arguing for some of the medical, against some of the medical unifying, she's talking about instances where people might die if, for example, less attention is paid to more detailed explanations or scientific views. Does that help at all?
Not for now, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
A question down here and then coming further forward again.
Thank you very much for your talk. If you go to the early patristic writers of the early Christian era, you will find that unity versus plurality is not a dialectic, nor is it a problem. Because God is God, and of his essence he's God, and that's that. And creation is creation, and they're of their essence, and that's that. And the essence of God is unity, and the essence of creation is diversity. And it's meant to be that, that's what it is.
Yes.
So you won't find a unifying state within creation any more than you'll find a diversity state within God.
Yes.
And that's the point of the Christian thing. There isn't a problem there.
Thank you.
It only comes when you have incarnation and deification, and the two then come together.
Thank you, yes. In a sense, this is what, and I agree with you, of course, in a sense, this is what Pannenberg is hearkening back to. He might be saying, or we might put it this way, he's saying that as we have forgotten these earlier thinkers, and in a way, Nancy Cartwright does us a favor by hearkening back to John Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas and some of these figures. Yes, much earlier. And yes, even much earlier, as you're indicating. It's as if we've forgotten a scheme that can help us to understand reality. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
You briefly mentioned Polkinghorne, and of course Polkinghorne also writes on the Trinity and considers himself a bottom-up thinker, a term used for Pannenberg. I don't see how they connect, and could you just help clarify a little bit how their bottom-up approach differs when it comes to Trinity?
Yes. Well, in fact, John Polkinghorne, he examined my doctorate, by the way. John Polkinghorne and Pannenberg, in my view, don't connect very much at all. And in fact, they famously debated ideas like Pannenberg's misunderstanding of field of force. And so in a way, they almost seem to be talking past each other. So you're onto something there, is a rough answer. Generally, just the fact that, and indeed, that bottom-up term I get from Polkinghorne, not from Pannenberg. So it is more of a Polkinghornian term, we might say. Only in the sense, they connect at that point only in the sense of wanting to start with the natural world, which any of us, regardless of views, can access. Public knowledge, as Pannenberg calls it. Thank you very much.
Question just here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Have you heard of Dr. John Spitzer, the Jesuit?
I have not.
Okay, we recently, so we're amateurs, we're complete amateurs, we're theologians really, that's our base. On the internet recently, Dr. Spitzer was saying actually that God recently has been proved. It's very, very recent. Okay, where he comes from is scientists coming from a cosmological basis, whether it's universe or multiverse, He sees it from the perspective of it's so finely tuned and balanced to the zenith that if it was out either way, you'd have, it just couldn't happen. So that takes me back to Thomas Aquinas' prime mover. It's far above me to discuss. If anybody is interested, it is completely riveting, but frankly, just says what believers would think anyway. From a faith perspective, but from the science, he is phenomenal. Because one, he's Jesuit, those minds are mind-blowing, and it's science, 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 which I don't think is, well, you can't refute, because it's just, and also he says there is no way that you could actually prove that God doesn't exist, because you would have to in effect be God to prove God doesn't exist. You would have to know everything, and he goes into multiverses like they were tissue paper. He just, it's very, very enlightening. It's Dr. Robert Spitzer, Jesuit, YouTube, about an hour and a half lecture introduced by the Dominicans out there. Riveting, well recommended.
I shall look him up.
God's been
Thank you very
proved.
much. Thank you.
Phenomenal, scientific.
So would you like to comment on, say, fine-tuning?
Yes,
plurality?
cosmological fine-tuning. In fact, I'm teaching on it tomorrow in Oxford. If you want to come to the tutorial, it's one of the. I mean, initially, cosmological fine-tuning was not necessarily a Christian idea. Christians have latched onto it, particularly in science and religion studies, and in saying things. For example, I mean, it's about human existence and how if things were off, the cosmological constants, this, that, and the other, were off by little bits, which is what you're alluding to, we wouldn't be here. The problem with saying this is evidence for God is that we can't get outside of this system to measure what it might be like if things were not apparently fine-tuned. So I don't think it's really evidence for anything. It's just rather nice that we exist, isn't it? So thank you, God, or fine-tuning.
I'll take one final question over on the other side.
Thank you very much. I'm a little nervous when people use the word hypothesis,
Thank you.
because it seems to me that there's a very big difference between a scientific hypothesis, which is refutable, and a hypothesis in a more general sense. Here's a suggestion which might have some kind of rational criteria. And one of my problems with Dawkins is that he accuses God of being a hypothesis, which in one sense it is, but it's certainly not what I would call a scientific hypothesis.
Yes.
And particularly with Pannenberg, you use the word hypothesis.
Yes.
I'd like you to expand on that a little bit.
Yes. I mean, this is one of the problems that I tried to allude to and talk in more detail in the book. Can one test theological hypotheses? There's rather a problem there, as you indicate. Not in the same way as one can test scientific hypotheses, certainly not. And so there are limits, you are right, to calling a theology scientific or to couching theology in hypothetical terms. However, I think that it's better to think of theology in terms of the hypothetical than to say we're absolutely 100% certain this is right and not be open even to having your mind changed. And I think that's when we really are in dangerous territory, even with belief in God, is what I'd say. So something like a hypothesis, healthier, I think, to have. Is it the same as a scientific hypothesis? No, it's not the same. Thank you very much.
And on that note, I think I'll draw our discussions to a close this afternoon. We've had our minds stretched. We've learned a lot about things in unity, diversity, science, philosophy, religion. Can you join me in thanking Shaun for his presentation?